The story of the super heavy jetliner is a story told in two parts. Hailing from the United States of America, the Boeing 747 rewrote the book on what it means to be a long-haul aircraft in the 1970s, and a few decades later, the Airbus A380 made its own claim to jumbo-size supremacy from across the pond. Both planes were among the largest ever built, certainly the largest to ever carry passengers in commercial service, and in their day, they were a flight of fancy, not just around what air travel experience could be, but what it meant to have a truly interconnected world. But if a couple of small things had gone just a little bit differently, the history of jumbo jet aviation might have gone very differently, and all because of one plane, the McDonnell Douglas MD-12. Designed to put the Boeing 747 out of business and proposed when the Airbus A380 was barely a twinkle in Europe's eye, the MD-12 was a revolutionary concept that many believed would dominate the airline industry. But a quick look at any international airport quickly belies the truth that the MD-12 is nowhere to be found. So today we're going to explore both the rise and fall of the MD-12, a jet that could have changed everything, but died before it ever hit the tarmac. Now, the story of the MD-12 is inseparable from the story of the Boeing 747. After all, without the 747, the MD-12 might never have been thought up at all. So, when the 747 first entered service in the 1970s, it had an immediate effect on the aviation industry. Not only did it have the highest passenger capacity of any jet of its time, but it cut the costs of a seat in half, making aviation far more available to the masses than it had been before. The 747's incredible range meant that global direct flights, once an impossibility, were now just a convenient part of everyday life. In a world where global, constant digital communications didn't yet exist, the 747 was infinitely more dependable than trying to hop around the world on a series of shorter flights. And at the time the 747 arrived to the scene, twin-engine aircraft weren't even allowed to fly across the Atlantic. But the 747's industry dominance meant that Boeing had a de facto monopoly on long-haul travel. Any airline that wanted to offer such a service knew that there was only one aircraft supplier worth talking to. Just before we jump back into today's video, I do want to take a moment to tell you about our fantastic sponsor, and that is Sheath. Stretchy underwear. It's really stretchy. It's very comfortable. Sheath makes the most comfortable boxer briefs that you've ever worn. Look, have you tried boxers? Maybe they're a bit too loose. You've tried briefs, they're too tight. I've always been a bit more of a boxers man, but Sheath are that perfect middle. I'm wearing a pair of Sheath underwear right now. Under these trousers, I got another pair. Clean, unworn, believe me, in my hands, and they are absolutely the go-to. My underwear drawer is now just Sheath. It's just full of Sheath because all of my other underwear has slowly been thrown away. Sheath's stretchy fabric, as I said, and moisture-wicking technology keeps you cool and comfy no matter what you're up to. They're particularly fantastic for the gym, by the way. All the time in the gym with these. They've got a dual pouch system to keep everything in its right place. It's got different pockets for your different man parts so that you might be skeptical of that. But get a pair of Sheath, try it out, and you'll realize what it's all about. And you'll be like, oh, cool, now I'll get some more Sheath. And the next thing you know, your underwear drawer is full of them. But if you're not feeling that, look, I don't always use this. It's not always necessary. You can just wear them as regular underwear, and they're fantastically comfortable. So here's the deal. Head to sheathunderwear.com and check out their new bamboo pairs. Your nether regions will thank you. And for a little extra love, use the promo code MEGA to snag a fantastic 20% discount on your order. That's sheathunderwear.com, promo code MEGA. Thank you for sponsoring Sheath, and now back to today's episode. Of course, Boeing wasn't complaining, but the same couldn't be said for their competitors, primarily the European company Airbus and the American company McDonnell Douglas. Formed between the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, famous for the F-4 Phantom and the Mercury and Gemini space capsules, and the Douglas Aircraft Company, best known for their iconic commercial and military transport planes, McDonnell Douglas had since become an aerospace juggernaut in their own right. Just for some context, some of their greatest exploits include the F-15 Eagle, the F-A-18 Hornet, and the AH-64 Apache helicopter in the military sphere, and their iconic tri-engine DC-10 and MD-11 commercial airliners. But even despite their business success elsewhere, McDonnell Douglas was impotent when it came to challenging the 747. And as the economies of the world continued to swell, the market for the 747's long-haul capacity was only growing. Economies were booming in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. When the Soviet Union began its collapse, a whole other part of the world suddenly just opened up to intercontinental travel. With no other aircraft to compete, Boeing was sure to step in and fill the void, while companies like McDonnell Douglas were once again left in the dust. So yeah, that wasn't going to work for the company, and despite the potentially staggering costs of developing an alternative, McDonnell Douglas decided that it'd be worth to at least have a crack at it. The first thing they tried was to make a modification to their existing MD-11 trijet known as the MD-12X. In the early stages, the company wasn't really trying to make any massive changes either. They'd hoped that just by stretching the fuselage of the MD-11, they'd be able to add enough carrying capacity to make it a decent alternative to the 747-1 that they could advertise as a lower cost, more appropriate option for, well, all but the longest flights. But before long, they realized that such a small change wouldn't really make them competitive with the 747 at all. So their next trick was to add a bottom deck to the front section of the MD-11, in contrast to the top deck of the 747, with the added benefit that their lower deck would be outfitted with panoramic windows. And to their credit, that does sound really, really cool. But this, too, did pose a couple of problems. If it was really going to compete as a long-haul airliner, the MD-12X would probably need to use a quad-engine design. And if McDonnell Douglas were going to the trouble of adding so much capacity, there was no real reason to keep constraining themselves to the other limitations of a stretched design or a partial second deck. And as the design evolved, so did the cost projections of the project, and the company began to restructure in order to accommodate their new jumbo jet. In late 1991, the company separated its civil and its military development groups, hoping that this would make it easier to attract investors with peace of mind that they wouldn't be footing the bill for McDonnell Douglas's big cost sink at the time, the C-17 Globemaster. Also at the same time, they signed partnerships with the Taiwan Aerospace Corporation and a number of other Asian companies, keeping a majority share in the project for themselves. At the time, McDonnell Douglas estimated that the costs of the entire development project were around $4 billion. In today's money, that's well over $9 billion. Within just about 6 months, McDonnell had their design ready to announce to the public. The timeline was ambitious. A program launch in 1992, a prototype ready by 1995, and a first flight by 1997. But the public interest was there to match. When their design, now called the MD-12, was presented to the world, it was an instant success in the public consciousness. It had clear similarities to an Airbus concept that would later grow into the A380, which was then known as the A3XX, as well as Boeing's NLA, or New Large Airplane. With all these programs floating around at once, all of them superior on paper to the 747, the global message was pretty clear. The future was coming, and it was coming by way of a really goddamn massive plane. Now, when the design for the MD-12 came out, it was immediately received as a game changer, and for good reason. Drawn up as a 4-engine aircraft, the plane featured a double-decker design all the way from the front to the back. In a 3-class long-haul configuration, it would have carried 430 passengers, 14 more than the Boeing 747-400. But if it was set up in an all-economy configuration, it would have been able to seat 511. That's nearly 100 more than the Boeing. And with a range of 9,200 miles, that's 14,825 kilometers, it would have slightly overmatched the 747, placing it squarely in the realm of a direct competitor in a way that no other jet had been able to offer. The MD-12 was intended to be flown by a pilot and a co-pilot, as is standard for commercial travel, with a nearly square profile at 208 feet at 63.5 meters long and a wingspan of 213 feet or 65 meters. This made it a bit smaller than the 747, although its double-decker design obviously made up for what it might have lost in carrying capacity. The plane's tail would have reached a full 74 feet from the ground, and at an empty weight of over 400,000 pounds, that's 200 tons, it could have more than doubled its weight for a maximum takeoff weight of nearly 450 tons. This, by the way, also beat out the 747-400 by a fair margin. The MD-12 was also expected at a top speed of 650 miles per hour, 70 miles an hour faster than its Boeing competitor. Not only that, but McDonnell Douglas ensured that with their plane came variants too. The default version, referred to as the MD-12HC or high capacity, would have put the 747's carrying capacity to shame, while the MD-12LR or long range would have been focused on even more extreme flights than the initial design would have done. The MD-12ST, or stretch, would have added even more seating capacity, and the MD-12 twin would have been a 2-engine model, which we can assume would have meant a somewhat smaller plane, or the design might have been kept in reserve until more modern efficient engines became available. All things considered, the MD-12 design was built with one clear, core message in mind. This plane was better than the 747. And if a company was given the choice between acquiring a 747 and an MD-12, it should choose the MD-12 every time. At least on paper, the plane had no deficits when compared to the 747, and it targeted and won up to the 747's key strengths with all the precision and bluntness of a political attack ad. McDonnell Douglas wasn't exactly looking to blow the 747 out of the water either. It didn't need to. It just needed to do enough with the MD-12 that it could consistently edge out its competitor, and at least in principle, that's exactly what it did. But shortly after the MD-12 was announced to the world, the project sustained a fairly massive blow when Taiwan Aerospace pulled out of the project entirely. Just days after the project launched, the chairman of Taiwan Aerospace, David Huang, resigned over discussions with the Taiwan government on whether or not they should collaborate with the company. Within a year, the government was out almost entirely, announcing that they'd scale back involvement with McDonnell Douglas in a major way. Taiwan Aerospace had been responsible for about $2 billion of the financial liability for the MD-12, meaning that without them, the project was left out in the cold. And to make matters worse, when McDonnell Douglas began courting potential buyers to place their orders for the MD-12, nobody was willing to bite. Several companies expressed interest in the plane, but with not even a prototype to look at, none of them could justify taking a risk on a product that might have been good, but might have been bad. McDonnell Douglas's status as a military contractor also hurt its chances. After all, if a several billion-dollar award came in from the US government for a new fighter jet, then Delta Airlines was probably going to have to wait for their new airliner. And the MD-12 came at a time when airlines were looking to cut costs, not add them. Layoffs were common in the industry, manufacturers were slowing down production, and airlines were running fewer and fewer routes. Even if the MD-12 hadn't come along, these companies probably wouldn't have been buying up more 747s anyway, and while many airlines could agree that the MD-12 would be a really cool plane to have, they also understood that following the rule of cool was no way to run a business in hard times. By 1993, industry analysts were speculating that McDonnell Douglas might close down their commercial aviation business entirely. Apache helicopters, Tomahawk missiles, and F-15 fighters had been fantastic earners for the company, and the company was doing very well in terms of its ability to secure contracts, but the commercial side of the company was absolutely hemorrhaging money, up to $3 billion in the preceding 5 years. There was little hope that they were going to recoup any of that value. But none of this was really the final nail in the MD-12's coffin. Instead, that would come from the likeliest source of all, Boeing, who announced in December 1996 that they were purchasing McDonnell Douglas outright. By this time, the MD-12 prototype had long since been cancelled, and the designs were given over to Boeing with everything else. Now, this moment in the MD-12's short history brings up a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. Which came first? The MD-12 driving up the value of McDonnell Douglas and making them look like a scary potential competitor, incentivizing Boeing to acquire them faster and pay more to do it? Or was the apparent commercial failure of the MD-12 and the sunk cost and PR black eye of the project catastrophic enough for McDonnell Douglas to cling to the Boeing offer like a life raft? As of now, we simply can't say, and unless a former executive from either company decides to include it in their tell-all memoir, we probably won't find out. But one way or another, the death knells of an independent McDonnell Douglas coincided with the end of the MD-12 project in a way that's impossible to ignore. It should be no surprise that Boeing, who already had bailed on their own new large airplane concept, had no desire to funnel their money into resuscitating the MD-12. It would be far too expensive, it was wrong for the times, and with the Airbus A380 still over a decade away, there was no existential threat to the 747 that would have justified building a replacement aircraft. It's a common theme in the airline industry that innovation is somewhat less important than just staying ahead of the next best plane. And with no next best plane to make Boeing sweat, the MD-12 design was just permanently shelved. It's possible to know for sure what might have been if the MD-12 had arrived just at a slightly earlier time, or just one or two airlines had taken the leap and bet on the airplane's potential. Perhaps the 747 would have been made obsolete or slowly faded from relevance. Perhaps there would be no Airbus A380. Or perhaps it would have pushed Airbus and Boeing to create even bigger, even longer-haul aircraft, setting off an arms race in commercial aviation. Or maybe the MD-12 would have been a flop, suffering through the same challenges as the beleaguered A380, or even being phased out after just a few short years from arriving on the scene. With the A380 and the 747 both leaving the airline industry today in favor of modern, fuel-efficient twin jets that can do their own long-haul trips, it seems highly unlikely that any new jet will emerge that looks anything like the MD-12. It was a bold design, a fantastically impressive one, but it was a relic of an age that's already gone.